Join me as I take on the challenge of uncovering the mystery behind the Faceless Woman of Route 66 in 2024. The allure of Route 66 is undeniable, a highway that stretches across America, weaving together tales of adventure, freedom, and mystery. And among these tales, one enigmatic figure stands out: the Faceless Woman. A presence so shrouded in secrecy, her very existence is a question mark. Urban legends and whispers of eerie encounters have cemented her place in the annals of Route 66 folklore. Identifying the Faceless Woman is a daunting task, perhaps even an impossible one. Her anonymity has spawned a multitude of theories, with some claiming she's a ghost, others a hoax, and a few even believing she's a real person, hiding in plain sight. This air of mystery has captivated travelers and locals alike, making her an integral part of the Route 66 experience. The mystery surrounding her has become an attraction in its own right, drawing in the curious and the brave. Many have attempted to uncover her true identity, but all have failed, leaving behind only more questions. As you drive along the Mother Road, you can't help but wonder, who is this woman, and what's her story? Why has she become an integral part of Route 66's mystique? Her enigmatic presence has captivated our imagination, leaving an indelible mark on our collective psyche. It's almost as if she's beckoning us to solve the mystery, to peel back the layers and reveal the truth. Despite the many attempts to shed light on her identity, the Faceless Woman remains an enigma. Her secrecy has only fueled our fascination, transforming her into an urban legend of epic proportions. Rumors abound, with some claiming to have seen her, while others deny her existence altogether. The truth, much like the woman herself, remains elusive. Delving into the origins of the legend, we find a tangled web of accounts, each one weaving a unique narrative around the Faceless Woman. According to some, she's the spirit of a woman who died on Route 66, her ghost doomed to roam the highway for eternity. Others claim she's a time traveler, stuck in a perpetual loop, reliving the same moment over and over. The sheer diversity of these accounts is staggering, with each one adding another layer to the mystery. But beneath the surface, a common thread runs through them all: a sense of tragedy, of loss, of longing. It's as if the Faceless Woman is a reflection of our own darkest fears, our deepest desires. The more we learn, the more we realize how little we know, and the mystery only deepens. As we dig deeper, we come across accounts from witnesses who claim to have seen her. Their stories are harrowing, filled with a sense of unease and foreboding. They speak of a woman in white, her face deathly pale, her eyes black as coal. These eyewitness accounts are the closest we've come to uncovering the truth, yet they only raise more questions. One thing is certain, though: the Faceless Woman is more than just a myth. She's a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of the unknown, of the mysteries that lie just beyond our reach. And it's this allure that continues to captivate us, drawing us in with an otherworldly force. Recently, a key piece of evidence has come to light, one that could potentially shatter the mystery surrounding the Faceless Woman. A cryptic message, scrawled on a dusty old billboard, reads, "The truth is in the shadows." It's a tantalizing clue, one that hints at a far more sinister reality. Who wrote this message, and what do they know about the Faceless Woman? As we stand at the crossroads, pondering the mysteries of the Faceless Woman, we're forced to confront our own fears and desires. What drives us to uncover the truth, to peel back the layers of secrecy surrounding her? Perhaps it's the same force that drives us to explore the unknown, to venture into the uncharted territories of our own hearts. The fascination surrounding the Faceless Woman is a testament to the power of human curiosity, to our innate desire to unravel the mysteries of the universe. As we reflect on her story, we're forced to confront our own place in the grand tapestry of human experience. What do you think, dear viewers? Do you have a theory about the Faceless Woman? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the mysteries of Route 66, be sure to check out our next video, where we'll delve into even more secrets and surprises. Part 1. The Faceless Woman. The allure of Route 66 had always been irresistible. For years, the highway tugged at me, a lifeline stretched across America, connecting small towns with big dreams and even bigger nightmares. But no part of its history fascinated me as much as the legend of the Faceless Woman. Some say she's the spirit of a woman who died violently on the road, her face obliterated in the accident. Others whisper that she's not a ghost at all, but a time traveler caught in an endless loop of suffering. And then there are those who swear she's a shapeshifter, a predator in disguise, forever drawn to wanderers too curious for their own good. No one agrees on what she looks like, probably because no one has ever gotten a clear glimpse of her. But the stories are all the same. If you see her, something changes inside you. Forever. I was skeptical at first, of course. I always liked my horror grounded. Ghosts were fine for movies, not reality. But everything changed the night I met her. I was driving westbound along Route 66, chasing sunsets like I always did. There's a part of the road that runs through a stretch of forgotten desert. Miles of cracked pavement, skeletal trees, and abandoned gas stations with empty windows staring like hollow eyes. The air was thick that night, suffused with the smell of asphalt and a kind of emptiness that burrows under your skin. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. That's when I noticed her. She was standing on the side of the road, right beneath a flickering neon sign that said ETS. The buzzing sign threw jagged shards of light over her pale figure. She wore a long, white dress, a relic from another era, maybe the 1950s or earlier. Her black hair draped over her shoulders, tangled and glistening as if wet. Something about the way she stood felt off, rigid, like a mannequin, her arms hanging too loose at her sides. My headlights caught her just as I drove by, and for a split second, just a sliver of a moment, I swear her face wasn't there. It wasn't obscured by shadow or hidden by hair. It was just gone, a smooth, blank canvas where her features should have been. My stomach dropped. I thought I'd imagined it, just a trick of the light. But when I glanced into my rearview mirror, she was still there, standing perfectly still by the side of the road. She didn't move, didn't flag me down, didn't look after me. But she knew. Somehow, I could feel her knowing, like a cold hand trailing up my spine. I kept driving, trying to shake the image from my mind, but it clung to me like tar. The road felt longer than usual that night. Every mile stretched into infinity. At one point, I swear the odometer froze, stuck at 66 miles exactly, even though I had driven much farther. And then the radio went to static. A voice came through, whispering beneath the crackle. The truth is in the shadows. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, like multiple people were speaking at once, each one just slightly out of sync with the other. And beneath their words was something else, too, a faint hum, almost musical. I yanked the dial, but the station wouldn't change. The static hissed louder, and the voice repeated its message over and over again. The truth is in the shadows. Find her. She's waiting. I turned off the radio and rolled down the window, hoping the rush of cool night air would clear my head. But that's when I noticed it. The woman was standing in the middle of the road ahead of me. She wasn't there a second ago. I was sure of it. One moment the highway had been empty, and the next, there she was, like she'd stepped out from between the cracks in reality itself. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the asphalt. My car shuddered to a halt just feet from where she stood. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But she didn't move. She just stood there, blocking the road, her arms limp at her sides, head tilted slightly to the left, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And then I saw her face, or rather the absence of it. The blankness I glimpsed earlier was no illusion. She had no mouth, no nose, no eyes, just smooth, unblemished skin stretched taut over bone. It was impossible, unnatural, and yet, the longer I stared, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of recognition. I knew her. Somehow, deep in the marrow of my bones, I knew who she was. But the knowledge slipped away, just out of reach, like a dream forgotten the moment you wake up. Her head tilted further, and then she took a step forward. Just one step. That's when the lights went out. Not just the headlights. All the lights. The stars disappeared from the sky. The flickering neon sign went dark. Even the moon, which had been hanging low over the desert, was swallowed by the blackness. It was as if the entire world had been plunged into a void. And in that suffocating darkness, I heard the sound of footsteps. Not just hers. There were many, too many to count. The crunch of gravel underfoot, the soft scuff of shoes against pavement. A whole crowd moving in perfect unison, drawing closer, closer. My pulse roared in my ears, and I fumbled for the ignition, desperate to get away. But the engine refused to turn over. The key clicked uselessly in the lock, over and over again. Then the voice returned, no longer confined to the radio. It whispered from every direction, swirling around me in the dark. The truth is in the shadows. She is not alone. They are watching. Suddenly, the lights snapped back on. The woman was gone. So were the footsteps. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and silent as before. But something had changed. The clock on my dashboard read 3:03 a.m. That couldn't be right. I'd left town hours ago. It should have been well past dawn by now. And yet, here I was, trapped in the dead of night, with no sign of sunrise on the horizon. I sat there for a moment, heart hammering, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But then, slowly, I became aware of something else. A handprint. It was pressed against the inside of my windshield, smudged and pale, as if someone had leaned in close from the passenger seat. And written beneath the handprint, scrawled in shaky letters across the fog glass, were 4 words. I found you too. Part 2. A face in the shadows. For a moment, I couldn't move. The words on the glass sent a jolt through my body, a primal kind of fear that boiled under my skin. I found you too. The letters had started to drip, as if written in condensation, but the air inside the car was bone dry. I wiped at the windshield, but the message wouldn't smear or disappear. It was inside the glass, etched into the very fabric of my reality. That's when I realized that the handprint was still there, still pressed against the glass, as if whoever left it hadn't gone far. A cold panic seized me. I grabbed my phone and checked the time again. 3:03 a.m. No service. Of course. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, it was just me, the road, and whatever was lurking in the dark. I flicked the headlights back on, expecting to see her standing there in the road again. But there was nothing. Just the cracked asphalt stretching out into the night. I could still hear my own breathing, shaky, shallow breaths, but there was something else too. A faint humming, like a low, droning song at the edge of my hearing. The same eerie undertone I'd heard on the radio. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle tensed. There was nothing in the back seat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, a presence lingering just out of reach. I twisted the key in the ignition again, desperate to get out of this place. This time, the engine sputtered and roared to life, flooding the desert with light. I gripped the steering wheel, white-knuckled, and slammed on the gas. The car jerked forward, tires kicking up clouds of dust as I sped down the road. For a few minutes, it was just me and the hum of the engine, the endless ribbon of Route 66 unfurling ahead. I told myself I'd imagined it all. Just highway paranoia, the kind that creeps up on you when you've been driving too long. But deep down, I knew better. I could still feel her, lingering at the edge of my mind like a splinter I couldn't pull free. Then the headlights caught something in the distance. A figure. I hit the brakes hard, tires screeching against the asphalt. My car skidded to a halt just a few feet from the lone figure standing in the middle of the road. It was her. She was turned slightly to the side, her blank face hidden beneath a curtain of dark hair. The white dress clung to her in the cold night air. But there was something different this time, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. She wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, were more figures. They stood perfectly still, a silent crowd gathering at the edges of the highway. Some wore old-fashioned clothes. Others looked like they'd stepped out of the present. Men, women, even children. But every single one of them had the same featureless, empty face. I gripped the steering wheel, so tight my hands ached. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, blocking the road, their empty faces turned toward me, as if waiting for something. Then, slowly, the woman in white began to raise her hand. She moved as if underwater, slow and deliberate. Her fingers unfurled, pointing down the road behind me. I twisted in my seat, following the direction of her gesture. That's when I saw it. In the distance, barely visible under the dim glow of the moon, was a billboard. The old, peeling paint had faded over time, but the message was still readable. The truth is in the shadows. The same phrase I'd heard on the radio. The same phrase that had been whispered into my mind. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through the car, through my bones, through me. It wasn't music. It was a voice, many voices layered on top of each other, murmuring just out of understanding. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound was overwhelming, like a storm building inside my skull. The woman in white took another step forward. Without thinking, I hit the gas. The engine roared as the car lurched forward, straight at her. But she didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her blank face tilted slightly to the side as the car barreled toward her. And then, just as I was sure I'd hit her, she vanished. There was no sound, no impact. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone. I swerved to avoid the crowd of figures standing behind her, but they were already gone too, melted into the shadows. The car skidded across the asphalt, veering dangerously close to the edge of the road. I fought to regain control, my heart hammering in my chest. And that's when I saw them in the rearview mirror. They were sitting in the back seat, the woman in white, and a man, and a child, all of them with smooth, featureless faces. They didn't move. They just sat there, silent and still, as if they'd been there all along. I slammed the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The car skidded to a halt, and I threw open the door, stumbling out into the night. Cold desert air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I had to get away from them, away from the car, away from the road, away from the truth that was clawing its way into my mind. I staggered a few steps before collapsing onto the side of the road, gasping for breath. The car sat silent behind me, its engine idling softly. And then I heard the whispering. It was coming from everywhere, filling the air, filling my head. The same layered voices, each one slightly out of sync with the others. We see you. We found you. The truth is in the shadows. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside me now, an infection spreading through my mind. And then, through the whispers, I heard something else. A footstep, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I forced myself to look up. She was standing right in front of me, the faceless woman. Her smooth, blank face was inches from mine, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from her skin. And then, impossibly, horribly, she began to smile. Not with a mouth, not with lips, but with her face. The skin stretched and warped, pulling into the grotesque parody of a grin. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't just a legend. The faceless woman wasn't here to haunt me. She was here to replace me. And as I stared into that twisted, smiling blankness, I knew, deep down, that she already had. Part 3. The Vanishing Hour. I don't remember getting back into the car. One moment I was kneeling on the side of the road, the faceless woman's grin seared into my mind, and the next, I was driving. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and the engine rumbled beneath me as if the vehicle had a life of its own. The clock still read 3:03 a.m., frozen like it was carved in stone. Every attempt to reset my phone or check the GPS failed. The screen flickered, the signal disappeared, and the digits refused to change. I could feel the night stretching unnaturally long, as if time itself was unraveling. I should have been halfway to the next town, but no matter how far I drove, the landscape remained the same. The cracked highway, the withered trees, and the empty gas stations looped over and over, like a broken film reel. I glanced into the rearview mirror more times than I can count, convinced that something would appear. But it was empty now. No passengers. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't really left. They were in the spaces between moments, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect second to slip back into reality. And then I heard it. The radio crackled back to life, the same strange static, followed by that eerie phrase. The truth is in the shadows. I jabbed at the buttons, desperate to shut it off, but the dial twisted on its own, skipping between stations that didn't exist. With every flicker of sound, fragments of words drifted through. She follows. Time isn't what it seems. You were marked the moment you looked. There's no going back. Don't stop driving. A wave of nausea washed over me. My pulse hammered in my ears, and the weight of the night pressed down on me like a suffocating shroud. My vision blurred for a second, and the road ahead wavered. Only now, it wasn't empty. Figures lined the shoulder, motionless as tombstones. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all with smooth, featureless faces turned toward me. They seemed to pulse in and out of the darkness, flickering like faulty lights. I kept my eyes locked on the road, refusing to meet their eyeless gaze. I knew instinctively that looking at them for too long would be a mistake, maybe the last one I'd ever make. The car groaned beneath me, as if it too sensed the weight of the figures pressing against the world. My hands were slick with sweat, and my heart thudded painfully against my ribs. The engine whined as I floored the gas, speeding past the faceless crowd, but the road stretched endlessly before me, a black ribbon winding into nothingness. Then the lights flickered. Just once, barely a second, but it was enough. When the headlights snapped back on, she was in front of me again. The faceless woman. This time she was closer, too close. I could see every detail of her white dress, the slight stains along the hem, the folds that moved as if stirred by a breeze that didn't exist. Her head tilted again, the same gesture as before, but now there was something wrong, something worse than the absence of her face. Her shadow stretched across the road, impossibly long and writhing like it had a mind of its own. It wasn't her shadow alone. It was filled with others, shapes moving in the darkness, shifting, twisting, waiting to take form. The car hurtled toward her, and I braced for the impact. But just as before, she disappeared. One moment she was solid, undeniable, and the next the car passed through empty air. I fought the wheel as the car skidded to a halt, the tires screaming against the asphalt. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest, hammering wildly. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it again. A soft tap, tap, tap on the windshield. I froze. The tap came again, delicate, deliberate, like a knuckle rapping lightly on glass. It was the kind of knock you'd hear at a polite dinner party, not something that belonged on a lonely desert highway in the middle of the night. I forced myself to look. A face. No. An impression of a face was pressed against the glass. Not fully formed, just the ghostly suggestion of eyes, a nose, and lips that never quite materialized. It seemed to shift every time I blinked, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Then it whispered, "You're almost there." The voice was 100 voices at once, male, female, old, young, blending together into a sinister harmony. And then the windshield cracked. A spiderweb of fractures spread across the glass, radiating from the spot where the face had been. I scrambled to throw the car into reverse, heart pounding, but before I could move, something shifted in the passenger seat. I snapped my head to the side and saw her, the faceless woman, sitting calmly, her hands folded in her lap, as if she'd been riding with me the entire time. Her head turned slowly toward me, and though there were no eyes, I felt her gaze pierce through me, cold and merciless. "Drive," she whispered. I slammed the gas without thinking. The tires squealed, and the car shot forward, leaving behind the shattered remnants of the windshield and the writhing shadows. As I sped down the road, the clock on the dashboard twitched, just a flicker almost imperceptible. And then, slowly, the numbers began to change. 3:04, 3:05. The hands of the clock were moving again. Time had started ticking forward, dragging me along with it. The faceless woman didn't move. She just sat there, a silent passenger in my nightmare, her presence a heavy weight pressing down on my soul. I knew, without needing to be told, that there was no escaping her now. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of terror. For a long moment, she didn't answer. And then, without lips, without expression, she smiled. Not with her face this time, but with her entire being. I could feel it radiate from her, a cold, malevolent satisfaction that seeped into my bones. And then she spoke, soft and slow, as if savoring every word. "You'll see, soon enough." Ahead, the road began to twist, the dark horizon warping into strange, impossible shapes. The highway was changing, leading somewhere I was never meant to go. And no matter how fast I drove, I knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. Part 4. Nowhere left to run. I didn't know how long I'd been driving. The road had no end, no beginning, only an endless, twisting path through the dark. The further I went, the less familiar the world became. The desert faded away, giving way to strange things. Trees that shouldn't grow in the arid landscape, their branches twisting like limbs reaching toward the car. Shapes loomed in the distance, shifting like mirages that melted if I stared too long. But it wasn't the landscape that scared me. It was her. The faceless woman sat silently beside me, her presence filling the car like a dense fog. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but I could feel her there, pressing against my mind like a parasite burrowing deeper. The clock on the dashboard read 3:13 a.m., but I knew better than to trust it. Time was broken here. I was trapped inside a moment that stretched endlessly, pulling me into some place that shouldn't exist. I flicked my gaze toward her, careful not to stare for too long. She was facing forward, her smooth face blank as ever. But something about the way she sat, so still and patient, made it clear she was waiting for something. The hum I'd heard earlier returned, louder now, vibrating through my skull. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from her. "Where am I?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. She didn't respond. But I swear, just for a moment, her head tilted slightly, just enough to make my skin crawl. I pressed harder on the gas, the engine groaning under the strain. The trees along the road grew thicker, the twisted branches casting long, skeletal shadows that slithered across the pavement. The farther I drove, the worse it got. That's when I saw the first sign. It flickered into view on the side of the road, a weathered, wooden sign that looked older than the highway itself. The paint had peeled away, but the message was still legible. "End of the road, 10 miles. A knot of dread tightened in my chest. I didn't know what waited at the end of this road, but every instinct screamed at me to turn around. Yet I knew, deep down, that there was no going back. The faceless woman made sure of that. The hum grew louder, becoming a low drone that resonated in my teeth. It was more than just sound, it was pressure, like something vast and ancient was closing in on me. And then, without warning, she moved. Her head turned slowly toward me, and though there were no eyes, I felt her gaze lock onto mine. The weight of it was unbearable, like drowning in cold water. "You were always coming here," she whispered, her voice a chorus of others, layered and discordant. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. She smiled again, not with her face, but with her presence. It was like a hand running down my back, soft and possessive. "It's not about what I want, it's about what you've lost." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I couldn't grasp. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, the leather slick beneath my palms. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "We've met before, you know. You just don't remember. Yet." Before I could respond, the road in front of me warped, bending like liquid, the lines and cracks twisting into strange patterns. The headlights flickered, and the landscape shifted again, rearranging itself into something unfamiliar. Another sign appeared by the side of the road, just as worn and weathered as the last. "End of the road, 5 miles. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel in frustration. "What is this?" I shouted, my voice echoing inside the car. The faceless woman tilted her head, the same patient, knowing gesture she'd done before. She didn't answer, but I could feel her satisfaction, like a predator savoring the fear of its prey. The hum grew louder, filling every corner of the car, and I realized something horrible. I was driving in circles. The road wasn't taking me anywhere. It was folding in on itself, looping endlessly towards some unseen point of no return. I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. The back seat was no longer empty. They were there, the other faceless figures. A man, a child, a woman in a tattered dress. All of them sitting perfectly still, their featureless faces turned toward me. My breath hitched. I blinked once, and the child leaned forward. His smooth, empty face was only inches from mine, close enough to touch. I felt a cold breath against my cheek, though I knew he had no mouth. "Almost there," the child whispered, the voice not his own. I wrenched my gaze away, my pulse thundering in my ears. The road twisted again, spiraling toward an unseen destination. Another sign loomed ahead, and this time, it sent a jolt of pure terror through me. Into the road, 1 mile. The car shuddered, the engine sputtering as if it could sense what was coming. Panic gripped me, and I tried to turn the wheel, to pull off the road, to escape, but the car refused to obey. The tires locked, the steering wheel spun uselessly in my hands. "There's no turning back," the faceless woman whispered beside me. I could feel it now, something waiting at the end of this cursed road. Something ancient, hungry, and patient. And I knew, without a doubt, that it had been waiting for me. The hum reached a deafening pitch, drowning out my thoughts. The road blurred, the headlights flickering wildly. And then, just as the odometer ticked down to 0, the world shifted one final time. Ahead of me, a tunnel loomed out of the darkness. Not a man-made tunnel, but something impossible. A gaping void that swallowed the road whole, stretching into eternity. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car hurtled toward the tunnel, the faceless woman's presence wrapping around me like chains. I could feel the figures in the back seat shifting, their cold breath against my neck, their silent laughter filling the car. And then, just before the car plunged into the darkness, the faceless woman leaned close. So close I could feel the chill radiating from her empty face. "You'll understand soon enough," she whispered. The car crossed the threshold, swallowed whole by the void, and the world disappeared. Part 5. The end of the road. The darkness swallowed me whole, thick and suffocating. I couldn't tell if the car was still moving or if I was falling, plunging deeper into some endless void. There was no sound, no light, no sense of time. It felt as if I'd drifted out of reality altogether, lost in a liminal space where nothing existed but me and them. The faceless woman was still beside me, her presence cold and oppressive. I could feel her watching, though she had no eyes, her attention like a weight pressing against my skull, slowly crushing me under its gravity. And then I heard the hum again, soft and distant, like the first notes of a dirge played on a broken instrument. It wasn't just sound, it was meaning, folding in on itself, twisting around my mind like tendrils of smoke. Memories I didn't recognize began to surface. Strange, fragmented images, roads I'd never driven, faces I'd never seen. And yet they felt familiar, as if they belonged to me, hidden beneath layers of forgotten time. "You're almost ready," the faceless woman whispered, her voice drifting through the void like a lullaby. The tunnel began to shift, shapes emerging from the darkness. Roads that bent at impossible angles, twisting into spirals that looped back on themselves. Signs floated past, old and weathered, each one more ominous than the last. "No exit. You were always here. The road ends where it began." The car jolted as if hitting solid ground, and suddenly the world snapped back into place. I was no longer in the void. I was driving along a perfectly straight road, the yellow lines glowing faintly in the dark. But something was wrong. I recognized this stretch of highway. I'd driven it before, tonight. It was the same desolate strip where I'd first seen the faceless woman beneath the flickering neon sign. And yet this time, something was different. The sign that had once read "ETS" was gone, replaced by another message scrawled across the wooden frame. "You are the passenger now." The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through the car, through my bones. I gripped the wheel tighter, panic rising in my chest. I needed to get off this road now. But no matter how hard I tried to steer, the car stayed on course, locked to the center of the highway like a train on a track. The engine groaned under the strain, and the speedometer needle began to climb, inching past 80, then 90, 100. I glanced toward the passenger seat and froze. The faceless woman was gone. The empty space beside me was both a relief and a terror. I knew she wasn't gone for good. She was just waiting. That's when I saw it. A mirror, hanging crookedly from the rearview mount. It wasn't there before. The glass was cracked, the edges warped, and when I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. I saw her. The faceless woman stared back at me from the other side of the glass, her head tilted in that familiar, unnerving way. And as I watched, the smooth, blank surface of her face began to shift, skin rippling like water, pulling into shapes that were horribly familiar. My own face stared back at me. I screamed, jerking the wheel wildly, but the car didn't respond. The speedometer climbed higher, 120, 130, 140. The hum was deafening now, a swarm of voices whispering in perfect unison. You were always coming here. The road never ends. The truth is in the shadows, and so are you. The mirror cracked further, spiderweb fractures spreading across the glass. And then, slowly, inevitably, the face on the other side smiled. It wasn't just a reflection. It was me. And in that moment, I understood. The faceless woman wasn't a ghost or a monster. She wasn't some ancient entity haunting Route 66. She was a mirror, a reflection of everyone who crossed her path. And once you saw her, once you recognized the emptiness inside yourself, she became a part of you. The road had always been leading me here, drawing me closer to the truth I'd been running from my whole life. I was the passenger now. The car hurtled forward, faster than ever, the landscape blurring into streaks of light and shadow. I felt my identity unraveling, my thoughts splintering into fragments that scattered across the dark highway. And just as the speedometer hit 160, the world shifted one last time. The road disappeared beneath me, swallowed by the void. I woke up on the side of the highway, the cold wind biting at my skin. The car was gone. The road was empty, stretching endlessly in both directions. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, just a hallucination born from exhaustion and paranoia. But then I saw it, a handprint. It was pressed against the inside of my wrist, pale, smudged, and unmistakably mine. And beneath it, scrawled in tiny letters that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, were the words, "I found you." I stood there for a long time, staring down the endless stretch of Route 66, knowing that I'd never escape what had happened. The road had marked me, and no matter where I went, I'd carry it with me. The hum was still there, faint but persistent, whispering just beneath the surface of reality. I knew it would never leave me, because the truth wasn't just in the shadows. The truth was me. And somewhere out there in the night, the faceless woman was waiting, smiling with my face, waiting for the next traveler to cross her path. I turned toward the road, the empty stretch calling to me like a lullaby. I knew what I had to do. I took a deep breath, stepped onto the asphalt, and started walking. And